Well, I suppose we could think about starting. We're just on time. I'm Ken Melchert, your host, and I'd like to welcome you all to New Knower Philosophers. This is the first of a two-part series. Many of you heard Bob before talking about the national debt, which is, I guess, why there's a large crowd today, evidently. It's a two-part series on China. It's a lot to cover. This is, we've all heard and read so much about the Chinese ascendancy and whatever. Anyway, I should introduce Bob again. Some of you remember this. He earned degrees in economics from the University of Detroit and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's a retired marketer, economist, and international business executive who traveled the world for nearly 40 years. He began his international business with the Kohler Company, and after 16 years with Kohler, he went on to executive positions with 4 different multinational corporations. He retired in 2003 as a chief executive officer of the North American operations of a German multinational corporation. For the last 8 years, he has been a geo-economics lecturer in the Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, where he's lectured on forces of change in the 21st century with the theme, Money Makes the World Go Round. You may have heard that. His lectures have focused on the U.S. economy and the national debt problem, China's rising threat to U.S. hegemony, consequences of Russia's Ukraine invasion, demographic trends impacting the world's economic future, and other subjects. Today we are hearing Xi Jinping's plan for China to achieve world economic dominance in the 21st century. Something to give us all pause. Anyway, he is having a cinematographer film this. If anyone does, and they will pan to the audience and stuff, this will be on Facebook and stuff, you have the right to say you don't want to be photographed.
Anybody do not want to be photographed? Or?
Yeah, if you you'd like not to be photographed?
Okay, I'll focus on this area.
This area, okay. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's for, it'll be on social media, it's on Facebook. So
and
the odds are pretty good that your picture is somewhere there already. I'd be willing to bet. Anyway, Bob Srenaski.
This is going to be a little bit different in terms of presentation because this is a reduced version of a class that I do at the university. And my classes out there run for 2 hours, okay? And so we have a break at about an hour, and then we have approximately another 30, 35 minutes, and then I take questions. So I've broken it in half. So this is the first half of that, right? So I will finish it next week and then take your questions, if you don't mind. So if you'll hold them, and you'll have a whole week to think about the things that I said, and to do your research and tell me, you got that wrong, Bob. Okay? And here's the real thing. This is, of course, forces of change in the 21st century. And it's about China. And Xi Jinping, of course, is the leader of China. And he does have a plan, and they have a plan, to replace the United States as the dominant country in the world. This is a book that was written not too long ago in 2025. United States, China, and the Competition for Control. And there are more books, and more books, and more books. One of them I'll cite later on next week, written way back in 2017, that said basically the same thing. This is the competition for the future, okay? And I like to remind people that there are always points at which, we tend to think things that are going in one direction will continue going in that direction all forever, right? But there are inflection points, just like a bullet hitting a brick wall, a concrete wall, and it ricochets and goes in another direction. That's the way history is, and that's the way the history is of dominant economies in the history of the world. And these people want to replace us. This is a little bit of history. last century, of course, was the American century. Right? We played such a significant role, not only in the wars, but after the wars, after all the industrial complexes in the world had been destroyed by the wars, particularly the Second World War, and we had the only one left standing. Hey, we win, all right? So then but the people, the Allies who survived that war got together and said, there were only 20 years between the First World War and the Second World War. We don't need a Third World War. What can we do to prevent that from happening? And as you know, what they concluded is that if we became mutually dependent, if we were so integrated, some people call that globalism, and we created some organizations that established rules and basically had some off-ramps for countries that were having problems, we could prevent the Third World War. And I guess as we sit here today, we can conclude that's pretty successful, right? But we were the leader in all of that, okay? So that's why this was called the American century. This is, the listing here that you see are the largest 10 economies in those dates, for example, in 1980. So those 10 economies accounted for, as you can see, the top 10, about 76% of the world's total economy. Think about this. There are 193 countries who are members of the United Nations. And these 10 have 76% of the world's economy. So the rest of them aren't doing very well, are they? And China wasn't even playing a role. And in second place was the Soviet Union. That was the largest economy, second largest economy in the world, that plus Russia plus the Warsaw Pact countries. Right? And then look at 2000, how much has changed. Russia's not there anymore. All right? It dissolved, went away, okay? And the other thing is that during this period, China was a communist country with a new capitalist system. But if you can imagine and you remember, Russia then became a democracy and became a capitalist country. And we were looking at China and saying, wow, they are opening the gates and it is growing. So by that time, the world, 2 decades of phenomenal economic growth in the world's history. Look at this. The world's economy grew by almost 196%. That is phenomenal in those 20 years. We grew faster than that, slightly faster than that. Okay. So the top 10 of the world had that significant amount. And one of the reasons, and probably one of the greatest reasons that we grew that much, the world grew that much, and the United States did, okay? By the way, we had 10 consecutive years of economic growth. We created new full-time, 114.5 million new full-time jobs during that period. It was the longest period that we've ever had in economic growth in the United States. And we ended that decade in that century with the federal government having positive surpluses, taking in more money than it was spending, okay? But the real key, see those numbers down there, 36 and 54? That was the age of the baby boomers during this period. The baby boomers, the largest group of people, cohort group of people that were ever born in the United States, were reaching and were in their maximum productive ages, right? So if you're a baby boomer, this was what you did for the country. So that was very, very important. So we were the dominator of the world coming into the 21st century. We controlled everything. We were the power. And we were the hegemon. The hegemon is the entity that has the greatest amount of influence, right? The domination, if you will. So as I described, we had world leadership. We created those organizations like the United Nations, the NATO, World Bank, International Monetary Fund. All of those organizations, our country led in creating to make sure that we didn't have a third world war, right? And so we still have a dominating position in most of these. So huge influence in making the rules for how all things went in the world, right? And of course, because we had the dominant currency in 1944 when the war was about to end and the world's economy was an absolute total mess. Nothing made any sense. It had been destroyed. The decision was made in a meeting in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, when the Allies got together. They said, this is the first thing we need to address. We need to bring some financial order to the world. And they did so by saying, okay, so here's what we're going to do. The gold standard is gone, doesn't work anymore. The United States will maintain a gold reserve, and all the other currencies in the world will be pegged to the US dollar. So whatever your currency is, it will be exchangeable around the world to US dollars. So the US dollar became the world's currency, right? And today it is still about 80% of all of the international transactions are done in US dollars. Remember, we call it the petrodollar. So we were dominated there. And then, of course, military power as a result of that, and still today. So this is the position that we're in. We are the hegemon. This is the dominator, right? That the Chinese want to change, okay? Want to replace us. So along comes this rising power. This country over here, remember Mark Twain said, God created wars so Americans could learn geography. Right. So in case you're not, and I apologize because I had a pointer that doesn't work on this. But as you can, this is China, okay? And then you see Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and this is the Indian Ocean. This is India, okay? So that's where China is. China is slightly larger in landmass than the United States. It has there's another difference though. It has 4 times the number of people. We have about 340 million people in this country. China has 1.4 billion. Okay. There are lots of other differences too, because, so, after the end of the Second World War, followed by they had a nationalist government in China at the end of the war in 1947, 45. And it was led by a fellow by the name of Chiang Kai-shek. There was a communist revolution that took place, and they were thrown out of power. And Chiang Kai-shek and what was left of the army left the mainland China and went to an island called Formosa at the time, and that's now called Taiwan. It was replaced by a fellow by the name of Mao Zedong. And for a long time, they imposed pure communist collectivism on the country. Everything went to the rural areas. And the result of that was it failed, and hundreds of thousands, maybe certainly millions of Chinese starved to death. It was an absolute disaster. This guy came along, though, and said, as a matter of fact, he traveled when he was first appointed to the head of the Communist Party in China. He left China and traveled around the world to see what was going on. He actually stayed at a farm in Iowa, for example. Came back and said, we have to change this. So he allowed foreign investment to come into China. And the Communist Party didn't like that, and he said to them famously, white cat, black cat, who cares as long as it catches mice. Okay? In other words, forget about the system. We got to do something about all these starving people. And so he was the wizard who brought capitalism to China. And it grew like crazy. So during that same period, when we were drawing like those numbers, world 196%, United States 258%, China grew 301% from 1980 to 2000. And then it got even better for them, okay? So from 1980 to 2010, if you look at China, it went from way down here to barely being a participant in the top 10 to second place. Second place. Its economy grew by a factor of 25. 25 times what it was in 1980. It happened there. They had cheap labor, they had investment coming in to make stuff, factories, and it grew like topsy. So by that time, it had 11.3% of the world's economy. Back in 1980, it had only 2.7% of the world's economy. I don't think the world has ever seen economic growth that fast, any place in history. So it's a new century and it's a new game. We're in the 21st century and the game is they want to displace the United States. So from I'm trying to look here. From 2000 to 2024. So let's take it from the first 24 years of this century. Okay, our economy grew by 183.5%. China's economy grew by a factor of 15. 15 times what it was in the year 2000, and that was 25 times where it was in 1980. This phenomenal growth, and you can see it started to really take off there. One of the things that helped them to do that is they were admitted to what's called the World Trade Organization, so that opened up the rest of the world for them much more so than before. So here you have it, 15 times. And now, by the year 2024, China comprises 17% of the world's economy and still growing like crazy. Okay, and we have some other players. The rest of the world isn't sitting still. Look who's in 1, 2, 3, 4, fourth place, India. India's growing. Brazil is growing. They were not, India was here back in 2010, then it was up there in 2020, and now it's in fourth place behind Germany. So the world is changing economically. We really don't feel that, don't see that, but this is what's happening. Then this guy came along in 2012, and he's a different guy. Deng Xiaoping was focused on the economy. The Chinese Communist Party basically focused on infrastructure, that type of stuff, and politics, and never played a significant role up until this guy came along. And this guy said, when he came in, this is what we need to do. This is his objective is the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation has been the greatest dream of the Chinese people. What's he talking about? The Chinese dream. Here's what he's talking about. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank went back and put together what the world's economies were centuries back, okay? And if you look up here, you will see that up until the 1900s, China and India dominated the world. At one time, China had 33% of the world's total economy. And you can see it lasted for a long time. This is India. This is China. Right? And you can see, so the Qing dynasty, when they had all that growth, right, when they reached 33% of the world's economy, lasted 268 years. We're going to be celebrating our 250th birthday pretty soon. The point is, it doesn't go on forever, right? You can't assume that it's going to go on forever. So you can see where we were. Remember when Japan was going to rule the world and was going to own the United States? You see Japan over here? It didn't happen, didn't even come close. But through 1500, 1600, 1700, 1800, China and India basically accounted for half of the world's economy. That's the Chinese dream. That's what he wants to recreate. That's what he says the Chinese people are longing for. So they have two obsessions, main obsessions. You have to understand the Japanese. Right. One is what they call the century of humiliation. And that was from 1839 to, of course, 1949. Earlier in that, in that period was when they had the Opium Wars. That was during the European nations out to colonize the entire world. The colonization or attempts to colonize China during that time period in the Opium Wars. And of course the other one was World War II, when they were dominated by and victimized by the Japanese who occupied China during that time period. And then the other is the year 1989. And they are so focused on that because, as we heard, the Soviet Union fell apart. Okay? And it was because of basically revolutions in all of those countries. Remember the Rose Revolution, the Orange Revolution, and they had their own in Tiananmen Square. Do you remember that? Tiananmen Square in 1989. Remember the fellow who stood out in front of the tank? Well, that fellow died and thousands more did too, because we're not going to tolerate this. And that was the Chinese Communist Party saying, this is going to happen here. And that is still with them. So these are the two things that are top of their mind to stay in power, of course, and keep going forward. So they're really, that's what they're focused on. So once again, never let China be divided again. It believes it needs to establish its own security perimeter because it is surrounded by 19 countries. Some are unstable and some are unfriendly. And that security perimeter includes, this is, that's been granted, if you will, chunks of India, and certainly Taiwan, and the East and South China Seas. And this is the South China Sea. Okay, and South China Sea it has been international waters forever. Okay, not so anymore in terms of what China has done. You see that red loop there? China claims that territory as Chinese territory now. That portion of South China Sea is China. Okay, now you have to hand it to the Vietnamese, all right, because they are ambitious. This blue line, they say, belongs to Vietnam. Good luck with that, right? Right, but as you can see, what's happening here, and then you have the Philippines there, right? And then you have Indonesia and Singapore. So this is what China has been doing. It's taking those little places in, like little, I forget what they call them, shoals, in the South China Sea, and they've been building on them. And this is the amount of money that they have spent in reclaiming those areas and building airstrips and little communities in there to substantiate, to say, well, look, these are all our places, we built these, right? Hainan Island up there, though, it is part of China, and it comes down there. And what they have done in this time period is they've spent $50 billion building a huge military base there. So what does that tell you? This is extraordinarily important to them, all right? They're asserting their power in that area, and it's a source of conflict for the future. Once again, and Taiwan, we hear so much about, it is not large. It is 23 million people, and it is 5.2% the size of Texas. But that's one of the tripping points again, because it is part of China, but it's acting independently. And if you recall, that's what they want back, right? So, Xi Jinping is a believer in Chinese exceptionalism. Don't forget, this is one country, this is one culture, this is one race, okay? This is not a melting pot like the United States is. So he refuses to accept China's place in the role as America's junior partner, which he thinks we are. He is determined to restore China's rightful place as the leader of the world as it was back in 1800 in history. China's analysts believe that all they need is patience, strategic patience, because the United States is in gradual decline, both economically, diplomatically, and militarily. However, one never knows when they might see an opportunity to do more than just be patient, and that's the thing that hangs over us. China only needs to be patient. And this is what the world is going to be, and it's really clever. What the world needs is the great power diplomacy with Chinese characteristics, really important, right? Promote the building of a new type of international relations and building a community of common destiny for mankind. We are in charge. That's Chinese characteristics. And the other part of this is, and we don't give a damn what you do inside of your country. That's the new way. Forget about this human relations stuff and all that. This is what China's future is, what the world's going to look like in the mind of Xi Jinping. So he has economic objectives. He doesn't just trade. These people are very, very specific and are really good planners. So his objectives are straightforward. Internally, they have to be self-sufficient in everything. This is a country that 27% of this large country, slightly larger than ours, is desert. 15% is arable land. That's about it. But, so they're going to secure their future to be self-sufficient, and we'll see how they're doing it, okay? And the external objective is pretty clear. The world's economy will become increasingly dependent on China and its financial institutions. It will replace the US dollar with the yuan. That's the objective. And China will replace the United States, as I just said, as the world's financial hegemon. So, quite specific, two things. Made in China is he set a goal in 2015 and called the program Made in China 2025. These are the things that we are going to accomplish in 10 years, very, very specifically. All right? So they're going to be dominant in global high technology manufacturing, okay, and catch up and surpass the Western technology prowess in virtually everything. Okay? And then they'll use government subsidies. They'll create their own government entities if they have to partner with foreign companies. And then they'll pursue intellectual property acquisition through any way necessary to get there. Very specific. Here are the 10 places, things that they're going to focus on. Advanced information technology. They want to, this means we want to become number one in all of these. Number one in 10 years in all of these. Automated machine tools and robotics, really. Advanced aerospace equipment. By the way, they have 2 manned satellites in orbit around the Earth right now. Marine equipment and high-tech shipping, modern rail transportation, new vehicles and equipment, electric, power equipment, agricultural equipment, and new materials. Those new materials are, you might have heard something about them, they're called rare earth minerals and magnets that have been an issue that we've heard about. And bio, pharma, and advanced medical products. These are the things that we are going to become number one in 10 years. How did they do? Well, they now have 45% of the world's factory production capacity. Almost half. They're number one in production of steel and aluminum, even though they don't have the raw materials, but they bring it in and process it. They are number one in shipbuilding in the world now. They dominate solar supply chain from beginning to end. 5G communication equipment, today's state of the art, throughout China, and now they're bringing it to other places like Africa and South America. Consumer electronics, we all know about that. We don't have a piece of consumer electronics that didn't come from China today. Active pharmaceutical ingredients. Most of the drugs that we take, the pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. All right? So, Tylenol, all right? 90% of the ingredients that go into China, Tylenol, come from China. Robotics, high-speed trains, ocean port construction, and as I said earlier, rare earth minerals and magnets. Robotic technology is almost mind-blowing what they've accomplished, if you will. That's their secret weapon to fight tariffs, because using robotics, you can put a machine in a dark room and it doesn't get breaks, it doesn't get sick, it doesn't get time off or anything, it's robots, okay? So they have revolutionized manufacturing in that country, which is mind-blowing that they would even attempt it when you think they had 1.4 billion people there, the world labor supply, and they started off using that, making cheap stuff, but they're not making cheap stuff anymore, okay? Now, factories in China are more automated than factories in the United States, Germany, or Japan today, using information technology. They have more robots in the manufacturing, as a country, in manufacturing, per 10,000 factory workers than all other countries in the world, with the exception of South Korea and Singapore, and Singapore doesn't count, it's too small, right? So that's what they've done. They've got these automated factories now, using robots and artificial intelligence. Their factories will be able to keep the price of anything as low as they want. And it's an advantage against the United States in fighting these trade wars. And then there's energy, because to make all this stuff happen, you have to have energy. And that's a big issue here. It's a big issue around the world. Well, they've done some things there too. As I said, they've become the world's technological powerhouse. It used to be us, right? They're now there. We created an innovative ecosystem centered on electricity and digital networks. We need lots of electricity to run all these computers and all those robots and all that. They have the most extensive and durable national electric power grid in the world. I don't know if you're familiar with the United States power grid, but I did get involved somewhat back a ways when I was in a coal company. It's terrible. So there's a Northeast power grid, there's a Mid-Atlantic power grid, Texas has its own power grid. These things fail, they are privatized. They created a whole new one. And one of the key factors here is durable. This thing is built to supply the power and the most extensive in the world. They wired the whole country, and they did it in such a way that it would be durable and of course, maximum utilization, because it's totally integrated. It's one system as opposed to ours. They generate more electricity annually than the United States and the European Union combined.
Oh, wow.
That's what they're generating, okay? So, and I guess they're second only in terms of to Japan, right? So here, this appeared, by the way, in the New York Times recently, to juxtapose where the two countries are, okay, and where they're going. On the left there, well, this is drill, baby, drill, okay, that's where we're headed, right? On the other side here, you see the largest solar farm in the world. It is the size of the city of Chicago. Those deserts, well, they're becoming gigantic solar farms. In the mountains, they're building solar farms high in the mountains because it's closer to the sun. They have the largest and the second largest and probably the third largest. And they control all the components in the supply chain for solar power. They are the world's biggest polluter. They have always been, because they had all these people, and it was very clear before. However, their carbon dioxide emissions have been flat or falling for the last 18 months because of alternative fuels that they're using. So this just tells you what they've added in the last 9 months of 2025. They keep adding more and more and more capacity and doing it with That was what we talked. Last year, anyway, they installed more solar power than all of the rest of the world combined. So, wind turbines and solar panels were more last year than the rest of the world, okay? And Chinese companies are building electrical vehicle and battery factories around the world, including Brazil, Thailand, Morocco, Hungary, and in Africa. There was a perplexing situation that took place. Now, if you look at the top there, we said, oil prices should be coming down worldwide. Why? Well, because slowing demand, because the world's economy is slowing slightly, right? And OPEC, oil-producing countries, including Russia, have been pumping more oil, so more supply, lower prices. And then these alternative energy sources have been growing really, really rapidly. And so the forecasters were saying, well, the price of a barrel of oil is 65 bucks today. With this going on, it should be going down to about $40 a barrel on the world market. But it didn't. On Halloween, it was $64 a barrel. And then we figured out what was going on. China has been accumulating over 2 million barrels a day and putting them in their strategic reserves. Remember, they don't want to be dependent upon anybody for anything, right? Including oil, right? They put in about 330 million barrels in their strategic reserves thus far this year, and they're planning to add 169 million barrels additional storage as they go through 2026. And that's what's been happening, okay? China's secret stockpiles have been a great success, Mr. Xi Jinping said. So, and here's the way we have been doing things. In 2013, we decided that we could now build a nuclear reactor for electrical power, all right? And this was in Georgia, all right? So that started in 2013. 7 years later, it took them, all right? It was late, all right? And it was $17 billion over budget. And that we basically said, well, that's not working, we can't do that. In the same time period, China built 13 of these reactors about the same size. They got 33 more underway, and its nuclear ambitions are ambitious, and they are now in the process of building something, because it's a standard nuclear power plant now that they can take to Africa or they can take to South America if they want. So they continue to build. They created a massive workforce with advanced manufacturing knowledge and technology. So what does that allow them to do? It allows them to scale up a new factory faster probably than anybody else in the world. And the example is this. Xiaomi, they make rice cookers. You know what rice cookers are? You know, they're like hot pots, big hot pots. They make rice cookers, right? They decided to get into the smartphone business. And in a very short period of time, they used their technology, robotics and all that, and they got into the smartphone business, and now they are the leading smartphone producer in China in the mid-range price, all right? And then they decided, well, we better get into the electric car business, right? In a year, they scaled up, got into the electric car business, and now they are producing. That's their line there, and they built the third fastest electric vehicle in the world, or something like that. But that's with all those robotics and with all the technology that they have, they can do this stuff really, really fast, and they can shift to changing world conditions and demand conditions, and they've got all that power in order to make this happen. Last year, 62% of all the world's electric vehicles were produced in China. BYD surpassed Tesla. You know, it's really, I kind of like that, you know. Because they helped them get into business. Teslas were the #1 electric vehicle in China, about 5 years ago. And these other companies said, we're going to get into business. And they got into business. And they made nicer ones and better ones, all right? So BYD, which the Chinese, only the Chinese would do this. You know what BYD means? Build your dreams. They always put titles like that in English, all right? So they surpassed Tesla last year, and they're building more factories around the world. China is the world's leader in highway construction and rail construction. Their expressway system in comparison to, remember, they didn't start building this stuff until this century, early in this century, okay? And the important part is it's all new. It's all relatively new in comparison to what we have. So their freeway system is equivalent to the same thing as our interstate system, and it is twice as long as our interstate system, and new. They have more high-speed rail than the entire world, okay? 30,000 linear miles of high-speed rail. And in China, high-speed means in excess between 200 and 220 miles an hour. One of their trains has 18 cars. They're very long, they go really fast, and that train holds 1,200 passengers. Okay. Now, our governor of Florida was bragging just recently about the new high-speed rail line that they put on between Miami and Tampa. Said it goes 125 miles an hour. I said, oh my goodness. That's not high-speed rail. It's kind of, almost halfway there, right? But, so this high-speed rail is really good. Notice transportation. In order for an economy just to have an economy, you need to move things, right? You need to move people, you need to move freight, and going back to the beginning of time, they did it on water, okay? So that's ocean freight, and that's still the cheapest. Secondly is by rail, okay? And so they've got, as I said, 30,000 miles of high-speed rail. They can move freight around the country faster than any place else. And they're taking that technology to other countries. So they built a world network of seaports, okay? And we'll talk about that. So their Shanghai port, which is new again, okay? Port in Shanghai can move as much cargo in one day as all of the seaports in the United States combined, right? High-tech, robotics. And they're building a global communication network. What else does Elon Musk have? Oh, he has this thing called Starlink that he put up. Well, they're building one, 13,000 satellites in low orbit, so that you'll have a new world communication system. And they have the most expensive 5G communication network in the world, which is today's technology throughout the country. And they're taking that, as I said earlier, to other countries, to the continent of Europe and South America as well. So then there's what was called the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is how we connect other countries. We connect China to other countries. No, it's how we connect China to us, okay? So this goes back to the old the Silk Road that goes back centuries and centuries, all right? And it looks like this. So the blue lines are transportation by water, right? Cheapest mode ever, all right? And then the other ones are overland by rail, pipeline, or whatever. And this connects all Europe especially to China. They have 151 countries that signed up to be partners in this thing, okay? Remember, there are 193 countries in the United Nations, so a lot. Right? They have about 2/3, those countries that signed up have about 2/3 of the world's population, 5.1 billion people, but they only have about 40% of the world's GDP or economy, which means, what you're going to see is third poorer countries of the world that signed up for this, that don't have the infrastructure that they think they need, and China is willing to work with them on to provide it. So you can see where they focus. And the thing that they're leading with is ports, and it's with transportation, all right? Primarily rail, because these countries don't have modern rail lines, for the most part. Right? So they're building railroads, and then coming along with that are the roads that go to the rail lines and the ports. So you can see that they've been very active in Africa and in Asia, not so much in Europe, Hungary and Russia, shouldn't be surprised, and not much in the Americas. In Africa, they have built over 7,500 miles. This is kind of older. They're probably past 10,000 miles of road and new rail lines. They built 20 ports, ocean ports for ocean shipping. And they have more than 80 power facilities that they've built in these countries in Africa, which allows those African countries, remember the poor, 24% of the economy that was held by about 183 countries that weren't in the top 10. These countries are looking for this type of help, and they're getting it. And of course 5G communication, so they have modern communication. Latin America, this is really interesting, and it's something that we've not been aware of. These circles are port facilities in which China has been involved in financing, for example. And notice that they went over there in Caracas. It makes me a little shaky right now because we've got the Gerald R. Ford, largest aircraft carrier in the world, heading towards that area. That's a potential conflict site, right? But the one that is really, really important and that wasn't on there is the Chancay port. This is in Peru. And this, by building this port, and the Chinese own this one, this huge port on the western side of South America, they reduced the shipping time from South America to China by 20%, okay? And as you can see, Peru's up here, right? Shares borders with Brazil, the largest country in South America. And Argentina is down here, the second largest. And there's a major highway that goes from Argentina up to Peru. But you can see where Peru is. Peru has other advantages other than its location, rich in minerals, which the Chinese are taking advantage of now through an investment. Okay? In 2010, Beijing provided loans to acquire these mineral rights. Okay? And that port of Chancay is, as I said, is another example of Beijing's coordinated strategy to pair transportation and access to natural resources in a way that ensures its own strategic growth in the future. That's the Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America. And, of course, Brazil, you would think, it's in the Americas, its largest trading partner is China. It has a positive balance of trade with China. Its trade with China is more than double its trade with us, with the United States. Can you say soybeans and wheat and all those things? So there it is there. And this is Argentina. All right. You can see its largest trading partner is Brazil, which it works with. And then second is, guess what? China, not the United States. Xi Jinping says this, of course. China will replace the United States as the world financial hegemon. You heard that before. But hold on, you know. Maybe beautiful and handsome, but still has some warts, you know, some blemishes, okay? It has problems, all right? And we need to recognize those, and it knows that it has these. And they're serious, okay? They have internal problems and external obstacles. That Belt and Road Initiative, it's a problem. It's a problem for the host countries because China builds these facilities like a port facility, right? Doesn't give it to them, all right? The country owes China the cost of that port facility or that railroad line. So it's debt for these countries, right? But I wanted to point this out. This is important when we talk about port facilities and ocean shipping. 80% of all on the water ocean shipping goes through the Indian Ocean. 80% of the world's shipping goes through the Indian Ocean. Okay, remember we talked about they're claiming the South China Sea as no longer international waters. This is a really big deal, okay? Why? Because as you can see, the shipments are coming down from South Korea, Tokyo, all the way down here. And they're down here where Singapore is, in Malaysia, is the Strait of Malacca. They all go through that strait. That's a funnel point, if you will. That's a strategic point. All right? And then into the Indian Ocean. This is Sri Lanka, which we'll talk about later. But the Strait of Hormuz, that's where all that oil comes from the Middle East. It comes down through there and goes into the Indian Ocean and then goes through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And it goes through here. There's where the Yemenis are, the Houthis that are lobbing missiles at the ships that are going through, goes into the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, out into the Mediterranean, and to Europe and elsewhere. This is a critical shipping point, right? This body of water, and the East China Sea and the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean are absolutely critical to the world. And these are ports that China has been involved in building around the Indian Ocean. All right. Now they are commercial ports, with the exception of the one up there in Djibouti. That's the entrance to the Red Sea, and we have a base there. Just about every country has a military base in Djibouti. It's a small country. They don't do anything other than rent land to all the countries that want to build a military base there. But they call this their string of pearls because any one of these could be converted to a military base, to a naval base, right? Okay. And as you see here, Sri Lanka is the furthest south there on that shipping route going there through for all shipping, right? So, as I said, Indian Ocean, 80% of the world's shipping trade goes through the Indian Ocean. Critical. The Belt and Road Initiative, okay? The loans that they've made to these countries to build these facilities are strangling those countries' economies. It's a real problem. And as I said, Sri Lanka, remember the most southern point, south of the southern tip of India into the Indian Ocean, where all this stuff is going through. They defaulted on their loans. Look, they built that port for that little tiny country of Sri Lanka. And they defaulted on their loans, so then China has to refinance it, right? And that's taking place all over, all right? China has spent twice as much as the U.S. on overseas development, as of course the United States has. And the Belt and Road Initiative has been successful, if you will, but it's caused problems. There are construction flaws in these facilities that they built. Let me back up. They're only built by Chinese contractors, all right? And they use only Chinese workers, so they bring them in, okay? So they build them, and then they charge the countries for them, so they're not using, so you can see here. There's concerns over the corruption, so some of these projects that were on the menu have been canceled, okay? Financial problems, choking debt for these small countries, unsustainable financially. All right. So they built a big port like that in Sri Lanka, and if you don't have enough paying customers and you didn't have the market for it, you can't sustain it financially and pay down the debt or whatever it is. So they built them for their own advantage, if you look at what we were talking about, rather than being in the best interest of the countries. All right. And then, as I said, they use all Chinese contractors, and there's a lot of resentment over that. So the Belt and Road projects have been going down. They're not growing anymore. More and more resistance to it. The world is becoming very familiar with the problems that they've had. So is that Chinese dream fading? No. But it still has other problems. It has a pile of debt that it's accumulated. Okay. So the World Bank has a process by which they study total debt, a country's total debt. including your credit card debt, everything, household debt, business debt, and of course government debt, as compared to the size of the country's economy. So as a percent of GDP. And as you can see, China's is almost 30% higher than ours, okay? So, but the most consequential thing is the rate at which it has grown. Because don't forget, the Chinese economy really took off in this century, right, from the year 2000 on. It wasn't doing much before that. Its percentage back in the 1980s, almost 1990, was only 83%. Now it's 282%. So they're taking on a lot of debt. Okay, and of course the objective is to have their currency, the yuan, replace the U.S. dollar. And this debt isn't helping them. Okay, they've been doing something else though. They have been divesting of U.S. Treasury bonds. Don't forget when they first started developing, when Deng Xiaoping started the capitalist revolution, if you will, they made lots of cheap stuff, and they shipped it all to the United States for the most part, because the factories were built by U.S. companies to make cheap stuff and sell it cheaper in the United States, right? So when they did that, what did those Chinese companies or the U.S. companies operating over there get? They were paid in U.S. dollars. Those U.S. dollars went into the Chinese banks, right? So China was accumulating dollars like crazy. So what did they do? I mean, so they what? They're conservative. They bought U.S. Treasury bonds, okay, our debt. So you see the circle, all right? So the more they bought, the better, the more money the United States government had to stimulate domestic consumption so that those consumers could buy more Chinese goods and they could get more dollars so they could buy more U.S. debt, okay? So that's an oversimplification, but it's essentially true. At one point, China owned $2 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds. Think of this. They would never do it. But let's say they decided one day, we're going to dump them all on the market. They would crash the entire world's economy. But what they have been doing is they've been selling them off. And what they have said is, and it makes sense, is why would we take our money and invest it in U.S. Treasury bonds, which have the lowest rate of return of any financial vehicle in the world? Our government borrows more cheaply than any other country in the world. Which is unfortunately sometimes probably an incentive to keep borrowing, right? So they said, that's stupid, we're not going to do that. So they started divesting themselves of U.S. Treasury bonds and buying other bonds or whatever investments that provided a bigger return, right? So they've been going down. So they went from that $2 trillion that they had at one point in time to $1.3 trillion in 2013, and now they're down to $730 billion. But that does have an effect because they're getting rid of a lot of treasury bonds that they're selling, right? And that drives down the return on them. So you can see what they're doing. Or this is part of dollar divestment, replacement by the Chinese currency, right? To gain superiority. So, and in addition to which they now have declining economic growth in the country. They were growing their economy at a rate of about 10% per year for almost 30 years. And it's phenomenal. But you couldn't keep that up forever. They went from an underdeveloped country to what we call a developing country, and now they're a developed country. And developed countries don't have GDP growth on an annual basis up in those ranges. So this year they're at about 5%. We'll probably be at 2.6, 2.5, which is positive for us. And the forecast is that it will continue to go down, but still positive and still fairly healthy, but not at the rate they were growing before. And then one of the other problems that, while they were going through all of this, they had this real estate boom in China. 1.4 billion people, all this money coming in, what are they going to do about it? So they built houses, they built apartment buildings, okay? So at one point, this real estate development accounted for 30% of the country's economy. They just built and built and built. I'm sorry, I'm going over by a lot. So the proceeds from the land sales went to the local government coffers, right? And so real estate, as I said, accounted for that. Proceeds went to, and many Chinese households who are savers, by the way. The Japanese are savers and the Chinese are savers. They decided, hey, we'll take money out of the bank and invest in our own place, a new place, right? A flat is called an apartment. So that's where they put their savings. And there was excessive investment and excessive debt. There was bankruptcy by major property developers. There are millions of unsold units in whole vacant, newly constructed communities. And millions of pre-sold. They would, in order to get, when the boom was on, people were racing to get into these. So the developers were saying, here's what it's going to look like. You need to buy your unit now and then we'll build it. Okay, so there were pre-sold units. And now they're worth less than the purchase price that these people put into it, right? And many of those pre-sold units are now involved in bankruptcy proceedings and they can't sell them even at a lower price if they wanted to. And this is what one of them looks like. These are all over the place. This is a whole new development. Nobody lives there, right? It's probably sitting in bankruptcy and they're all over the country. These are apartment towers, right? As of 2023, 34 of the top Chinese property developers had defaulted on their loans to foreign investors. So they are now in trouble, and there's about $100 billion worth of outstanding loans in these bankrupt organizations. The bottom fell out. They estimate they've got 20 million unoccupied units in this country. 20 million. You can see, there's another one. They're all over the place. They built and built and built. So it's a speculative overbuilding, population concerned with job security now, falling confidence in the developers because they've gone through all those, and less demand from the aging population. So its investment is beginning to tank. Foreign investment coming into the country is not coming in anymore the way it had been before. So this is what's happened as a share of the economy. So they've got deflation now. They're making too much stuff. You've seen what's happening in the property sector. People aren't spending, and prices are going down. Deflation is a really evil thing from an economic standpoint, and it goes like this. Why should I buy it today when it's going to be cheaper tomorrow? Because the prices are going down. So people don't buy it, all right? So prices go down tomorrow, and they don't buy again, and it continues on down. And it takes government intervention to stop that downward spiral. All right? So factory output slumped in October, all right, for the 7th straight month, okay? And then they have a huge new unemployment problem. Now, overall, their unemployment rate, and this is reported by their agency, their government agency, is 5.3%, which is not that much greater than the U.S. unemployment agency. But here's where they got the problem. The young people, okay? People graduating from college, and they have universities all over the place. They are highly educated people. 19% youth unemployment now in the bracket 16 to 24 years old. Remember Tiananmen Square? Those are the young people. This scares the unit, okay? That's a serious problem. And over the long term, when we look for the long term, it's about population. Their population has fallen for the third consecutive year. Now, the population went down by 1 million people. When you got 1.4 billion, it ain't significant, right? But it's the trend, okay? And I'm going to show you what the trend is. This is today's workforce, okay? In all countries, when we look at the workforce in a country, we always consider people who are 15 to 64 years old. That's the workforce. And as you can see, it's starting to come down, all right? Why is that happening? Well, because the population, this is the newborns to 14 years old. Tomorrow's workforce, and this has been going on. Look what's happening in terms of the numbers. They're just, just going through the basement. So they have a fertility rate of 1. Now, to maintain a population without it increasing or decreasing, you need a fertility rate of 2.1, which means 2.1 live births for every woman in the population from 15 to 45 years old. Some can have more, some can have, but that just to maintain a population. They're at 1, all right? Their population is going to continue to tank. We're at 1.6 though, too, and the European Union is 1.4. So in order to maintain the population, it takes immigrants. And here's what's happening on the other end. We have this problem too, old people. Yeah, right? So that declining workforce and a workforce that's going to continue to decline has to support increasing numbers of old people, and that's a problem. So they've got that problem. So, and then they have another problem, which is corruption. China always has corruption. If you do business in that area of the world, most of the world outside of the United States, you have to figure out a way to make things work, and it's usually called money, right? So they have rising debt, so they have endemic corruption, party purges that go on. They have rising debt, declining economic growth, property developer debt, factory overproduction, inadequate domestic consumer demand, deflation, if you will, falling price cycle, high youth unemployment, and long-term population decline. And there'll be more next week. So that's where we are.
Good stuff.
All right. Well, what a lot to think about. A whole week to think about it. I did want to say that the schedule for next year, the part that I have done, that's a month or two, is up on Facebook. Go to Facebook, Noon Hour Philosophers, and the schedule starting in January will be up there. We'll see you next week.
Bring your questions.
More to come. I'm sure you'll have thought of something.
I have a ton of them.
One or two.
Yeah, this is a lot to think about. Thank you.